Right, we're back live with you tonight here on In Focus. ActionSA hosted its second policy expert discussion panel on economic prosperity in Johannesburg today. Party leader Herman Mashaba says it forms part of a broader engagement process ahead of ActionSA's inaugural policy conference in September. He joins us now in studio to shed more light on this. Good to have you, and thank you very much for your time.
Yes, good evening, and wonderful to really be in the studio.
Yeah, finally. Yeah.
Lately talking to you virtually.
Yeah,
and,
no, I'm
glad you came in.
I'm glad you came in. I'm glad you came in. Why do you believe this particular process that you are embarking on is unique? One would say, I mean, parties have policy conferences all the time. The ANC would have a policy conference, discuss policy documents, take them to conference, vote on them. What is special about the ActionSA approach?
I think just to remind you and the listeners, Thabo, ActionSA is the brainchild of a project called the People's Dialogue. When I resigned as the mayor in 2019, all of a sudden South Africans demanded actually that I form my own political party. I said, my goodness, where do I start? And I felt, I think I need to first engage South Africans because I felt betrayed on two occasions in my life. Firstly, by the ANC. I voted in 1994 thinking that what I grew up thinking they were, and only to discover no, they're not. And then obviously, secondly, with the DA, when I accepted to leave my business, my successful business, to join them, to democratically unseat the ANC, only to discover that DA and I don't share the same values. So people are asking me to start a political party, but then I said, what if I just go out and start a political party? What if I don't share the same values? I need to check two things. Firstly, I needed a scientific basis whether I've got the support or not. And secondly, was to then check on core values which were not negotiable. And if you look at that process which we ran for 3 months called the People's Dialogue, it was really heartwarming. It was rewarding because 33 million engagements over the 3 months with 2.4 million South Africans giving us the mandate. And then we immediately, once we had the numbers of 2.4 million people who said start the political party, we then started engaging them. During COVID, it was really interesting on a daily basis getting experts to give us inputs. Yeah. In fact, on the 2.4 million South Africans who gave us a mandate to start the political party, 165,000 of them gave us 10 to 12 page submissions on how to turn the country around. Wow. So with all this information, we really felt that when we go into our policy conference and consideration, we need to bring these experts because I think for us as politicians, we don't believe we've got the answers. I don't have the answers to this country's problems. Yes, I'm prepared to really stand up for my country, but at the end of the day, I believe ordinary South Africans are the ones who can assist in ensuring that the policies we adopt in September are policies that are going to respond to their lived experience. And I think that's what's coming out. Last week, the first one in Cape Town, I was really awed. I was really overblown. And today I had an opportunity to actually do the opening and closing remarks. And really what came out of there, it's been really exceptional, extraordinary. And we are going to continue with this leading up to the 12th of September.
So let's talk about what you highlighted in your opening remarks, the question of policy uncertainty. I mean, for as long as I can remember, I suppose even when you were still mayor, we would have the conversation about policy uncertainty and how this unnerves investors and those who would want to come into the country and start businesses and so on and so forth. You speak to the ANC, they'll tell you there is no policy uncertainty. The policies of the ANC are clear. We know what the policies are. Maybe the problem might be in the implementation of those policies.
I've heard that story. I keep saying to people, in fact, someone responded on social media platforms, says, don't waste our time. This country has got good policies. The problem is in implementation. I've heard this movie so many times. I did political science at university and I'm I'm an avid reader. If you look at the failure of socialist and communist the governments, it's not policies. That's what they'll tell you. It's implementation. But then, how can you claim something to be good if it cannot be implemented? So therefore, these policies are not good, because if you can't execute them, then how do you then claim to really have good policies? ANC does not have clear policies, and let me tell you why there's confusion. I think for me, with almost 40 years in business, I think as soon as ANC government took over power, their relationship, the toxic relationship with COSATU and the so-called South African Communist Party, unfortunately, we don't know where they stand. No businessmen in this country of substance, not tenderpreneurs. We don't know what ANC's economic policies are. Are they following a market-driven policies, or are they socialist policies? You can imagine a government that celebrates 29 million people on social grants, and the government that closes down factories. Last week, I was in the Free State in Botshabelo. And as you're aware, Thabo, I was born and raised in Manskral Babelech industrial area. Yeah. 70-80% of those factories are closed by COSATU, closing one after the other. So I don't understand how anyone can then tell us you are a business-friendly government when you're closing down factories, rendering 12 million people unemployed. Your quality of education being the worst in the world. But if you look at our spend in education in relation to our GDP, South Africa spends the most, but in terms of outcome, we are the worst. You'd rather take honestly, if you have to take your child to 80% of public schools here, your child will get a better education in Lesotho and Swaziland.
But maybe we're in agreement as far as that is concerned, because if you were to ask COSATU and Secretary, I've asked them a number of times on this platform, I've asked SAFTU, I've asked the ANC itself, they'll say that the challenge with the long term, for example, unemployment in the country, the closing of factories and so on and so forth, this is a byproduct of historical structural deficiencies in the labor market, mismatched supply and demand, skills deficit, and level of education. But then they're saying there is an unwillingness from companies, for example, to train and develop the current workforce to rise up to the levels of skills that they need to be.
But then that government is actually admitting failure, because people go into government to go and sort out the issues that they are telling their challenges. Let me give you a practical example, Thabo. Really what drove me eventually to throw in the towel in business and say, look, I can't live in a country like this, and I'm not going to run away from my country. Around 2011, 2012, I was invited to invest in one business. This business is a service provider to the mining industry. They were looking for a black investor. And they wanted money to expand their business, and obviously for them to really be able to operate, they needed to really have a black investor. So through my corporate advisors, put me in touch with these guys. Started negotiating. They wanted 130 million rand for a 30% share in the business. I looked at the business, I liked it. But obviously, I take myself to be a good negotiator. I used to play dice in my youth, so I know how to negotiate. So I negotiated this price to 100 million rands, because they needed money to really be able to expand their business and be profitable. I tell you, we agreed. These guys agreed, because they had no choice, and there was obviously 100 million rands to be invested in their business. I can tell you, before I could give the go-ahead to the legal people to start drafting the agreements, just one evening I had a concern with the long-term sustainability of South Africa. I said South Africa is not a place for long-term investment, because that investment was a long-term one. You'll only start seeing money coming and flowing to the investors in 5 years.
Sure.
But because I was concerned about the long-term sustainability of South Africa's economic policies, I said to my lawyers, I said, I'm afraid I've got to tell those guys I'm not investing because I just don't really trust this country that it can really sustain this kind of a long-term investment. And I'll actually go concern. I keep asking this question that you can imagine now a small investor, 100 million rands in a big scheme of things. It's in a South African economy, it's not money, you know. But obviously for me, it's a lot of money. But you can imagine now if a black South African, a patriot like me, who's scared to invest long-term in his own country. Now, just ask yourself this question. An investor in Sydney, New York, or Tokyo, anywhere in the world. Thabo, this is not a movie. This is a real practical example of South Africa. Over the last, even when I was in business, all my partners, they know, currently in South Africa, under the current regime, I only invest in getting the business to do what they're supposed to do. But any long term, I took that decision. But obviously, I'm no longer full-time in the business. I leave it to my wife and my partners to do. But one thing, I always discourage them from long-term investments because South Africa is not an investment-friendly environment, and which is my country with which I'm not going anywhere. But at the end of the day, it says to us, let's look at ourselves in the mirror. If here's a black businessman who's scared to invest in his own country. Now, how do I advise an American or someone from Swaziland to come and invest here? So this, unfortunately, Thabo, it's a practical side of the South African economic environment.
ActionSA leader Herman Mashaba still with us. He hosted a panel of experts discussing how to grow the economy, especially in South Africa. He is, of course, sitting here armed with a whole lot of information in his travels, but also in the experts that he was sitting with. One of the big issues, you're saying we've got stringent labor laws in this country that are preventing, for example, people from getting employed. You're saying we are protecting the employed at the expense of the unemployed. Tell me why in the 15 years that we have had the Employment Equity Act, we are still sitting with 7.4% of black people in top management and only 10.4% of black people in senior management. In 15 years, it's refusing to move. It has literally moved by 1 or 2%.
Well, I think, Thabo, look at it in relation to the economic growth. And David Rosa gave us a really quite head-rearing presentation, actually, to show how this country's economy has been underperforming. I think it's actually quite scary. You look at 12 million people unemployed in this country. With an economy that's growing, population growth is bigger than economic growth. I think that honestly, sometimes you don't have to really be an economist or be someone clever. Just really looking at facts and using common sense. You have population growth surpassing economic growth. You are looking for big trouble. And at the same time, you've opened your borders out. You want failed governments to outsource their problem to your country. That actually requires help themselves. And at the same time, you pass this draconian labor laws. I call them draconian, and I've been calling them draconian for many years, closing down SMMEs. I think if I look at when I started business in the 80s in this country as black businessmen, when we were not allowed by the apartheid government, how active we were, because we had no government for us. Actually, we had the government against us, but we were determined. When I grew up, Thabo, when my parents sent me to go and buy bread or buy meat, I used to go and buy meat from a butchery run by Mr. Mahlangu or Mr. Maponya or Mr. Dube. Yeah. Today, you go into our communities. I was in Ramotsi, Hammanskraal on Sunday, and I visit my family all the time in Soweto and other parts of the country. Unfortunately, the heartbeat of any economy, it's small businesses. Yes. We've destroyed all that by these draconian laws that have made it almost impossible. I'm sure you remember some years ago when I was still in business, was the chairman of the Free Market Foundation. I took Section 32 of the Labor Relations Act. That was a plan by COSATU and big business, where they made it impossible for Herman Mashaba, to start a cosmetic company in 1985. You can imagine, Thabo, in 1985, when I started Black Luck Mill with my wife and two partners, we'll employ one person, two, and so forth. Years down the line, we're employing 80 and so forth. You can imagine if we had Section 32 of the Labor Relations Act, this particular piece of legislation would have required me to pay the same salaries as Unilever, L'Oreal, and so forth. And now, how do you then operate in that environment? So today, for you to really start a supermarket in the township, that's why a lot of our people ended up renting their businesses to foreign nationals who are here. We don't know how they got here, and they don't employ our own people. Because the labor laws were making it very impossible. What happens? You run, as Thabo Mdluli running a supermarket which you've been running for years with your family and hiring local people. All of a sudden, the government passes laws. You must pay the same salary as Pick and Pay and ShopRite checkers because you're in the same sector. So what happens? People really went down. It was not really worth it. End up renting these businesses to foreign nationals. Why the foreign nationals are succeeding? They are not registered. They're here illegally. They don't employ our own people. They bring in counterfeit goods, which they don't pay any duties on them. So, and expect Mr. Mdluli in Dobsonville to compete with this criminal activity, because it's a criminal activity. And you expect Mr. Mdluli, who's a South African, committed to do what is right, to really compete. And unfortunately, COSATU and the Tripartite Alliance are I personally put them directly responsible for the destruction of small businesses in this country.
What is the proposal then in terms of the policy? How would you change that labor market regime?
Well, I think we need to really look at it overall. I think you can one day ask the first Minister of Labour, Tito Mboweni, when they were busy formulating this piece of legislation, used to own him a lot because at the time I was still very close to ANC people. And I really warned him. I said, you know, what you guys are proposing, you might have good intentions. Please ask your Russian friends why the Soviet Union collapsed. And you want to come out with laws that the Soviet Union has failed. Ask the Chinese during Mao's time until Deng took over. Now you want to come and try them here in South Africa. What we're saying is we need to really look at fair labor practice, because obviously vulnerable employees, they need to really be protected. Labor has got an important role to play. But as government does not only have the responsibility to unionize the people. Government has got a responsibility to everyone, including unemployed, including small businesses, big businesses, and so forth. But when you have a government of the Tripartite Alliance, that their only concern is those who are employed. And Thabo, I could guarantee you, in your own family, you've got lots of people who've lost their jobs. Yeah. And once they lose their jobs, COSATU is not interested in you. You are only good to COSATU for as long as you are able to contribute on a monthly basis. Because the leadership of COSATU, for them, it's a career move for one day be in cabinet and so forth. Look at right now, how many senior people in the government, from cabinet, parliament, in all embassies, they're all from union leadership. But what happened to the 12 million South Africans, our brothers, sisters, uncles, our community members who have lost jobs? And one thing, once you lose job, you don't mean anything to COSATU any longer because you cannot really subsidize them. Yeah. I want to share something with you. That
I'm out of time, otherwise I'm going to lose my job and then I'm not going to be meaningful to COSATU very soon. I'm out of time. I appreciate you. Thank you very much for coming on and joining us tonight.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. Much appreciated.
All right, that's Herman Mashaba, the leader of ActionSA.